Good morning, good afternoon, I don't know, wherever you might be, so you're very welcome. So now you're all in Barcelona. We're all together here to enjoy another great day of research, conversation, insights, learning. And I'm very grateful to our next speaker. I'm very grateful to all speakers, but especially when you get up at 5 a.m. in the morning. And you look like so radiant as Mona is looking now, as if it was, just like midday, but it's 5:45 in her time zone. So Mona, thank you very much for joining us to get us started on our second day.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Maria.
This is a very exciting topic that Mona is going to present. Most of you already know Mona well, either because you've read her research or because you've interacted with her in previous conferences. Mona has been here in Barcelona already quite a few times. So she's now as an assistant professor of human resources management at the College of Business at California State University. She's a mother of 2 kids, a brave woman who had 2 kids during her PhD, so quite an accomplishment. So now they are 11 and 8. And her research focuses on understanding the intersection between the personal and the professional with an intent to create workplaces where employees can be supported and can be their full selves. So this resonates very much with the discussions and the presentations that we had yesterday. Her recent research is focusing on the experiences of working mothers during the COVID. Working from home, based on that work, she's already co-authored a paper that has been published in Harvard Business Review to help companies support and care and retain mothers. So she's been presenting that research, and we also hope to engage in a very meaningful conversation with your questions. So any question that you might want to pose to Mona, please, write it on the chat so that we're able, to then have that conversation. So Mona, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Maria, for having me. It is 5, as you said, it is now 5:49 a.m. California time. And it's great to be here. Hopefully I'm caffeinated enough so that I can communicate to you everything that I want to communicate. So before we get to the 3 ways companies can retain working moms right now, and we use right now given the urgency of this matter, I want us to take a moment to read together some of the words of the working mothers that we talked with, which on the project that then led us to write this article to give tips to our companies and managers. So let's just take a moment to read those words and to reflect on them, and also imagine the situation that parents and mothers were in during the COVID year. My stomach is turning into knots just thinking of it. It was chaos. Every day a volcano is bubbling to the top. You're a mom or you're a worker. COVID has blurred those lines. There's no separation anymore. I'm struggling today because we don't get a break. No breaks. These are some of the words of some of the 54 working mothers that Dr. Dana Sumter and I talked with during the summer of 2020 across 10 US states. All of them are professional women who work in different fields, and all of them were working from home and had 1 or more kids with them under the age of 16 who had to also shift to schooling from home. So my goals with you today, this morning, is to, or are to, first to paint a part of the picture of caregiving during COVID in the US. So how did that look like? What those experiences were? And the main thing that I want you and myself to do is have these women's stories with us as we go into our breakout rooms and discuss our own research and push our agenda, our research agendas forward. And I will conclude this presentation by sharing some tips based on the stories and based on the data that we analyzed from these working mothers, some tips that companies can take with them in order to face and meet this moment. So let's go back to March of 2020. And this is my co-researcher, Dana, with her son there. And all of us, were experiencing that moment in different ways where we had to go back go back home and figure out how to work from home while also continuing to raise our families. So we started seeing the writing on the wall at the time. And as we lived through the COVID year, we started seeing some reports emerging. And sure enough, providing some evidence that the impact of COVID on women employment is going to be long lasting and it's going to be negative. And I point out the McKinsey report that went out in 2020 that showed that 1 in 4 women were actually considering downsizing their jobs or quitting altogether. By the end of 2020, 2.2 million women in the US had dropped out of the workforce because of the pandemic. And we knew by then that women were differently impacted by the pandemic. So at that time, we started wondering what was happening, what was going on, why were women so negatively impacted, why were mothers so negatively impacted, and how were mothers and families navigating their new work-family realities. And one of the things that as a work-family researcher, I know that those topics have been researched for a long time. So we were also wondering if we had missed studying something, or maybe it's an issue of translation of research to practitioners. So we jumped on it. We started interviewing women who were working from home, who had family responsibilities. In total, we did talk with 54 working mothers. 53 of them were living with a male partner and had 1 or more children under the age of 16. 61% were white and 39% identified as women of color. So in the next few minutes, I want to share with you what we learned from what they have told us about work culture during COVID-19. And then, as I said earlier, conclude with what can companies do about it right now as we re-enter the workplace in terms of going back to the office. So here's what we learned. And I know that, last time we met for the International Conference of Work and Family at IESE, we talked about the ideal worker image and the ideal worker culture. So here's what we found in terms of that culture. We found an entrenchment of the ideal worker image. So the ideal worker culture became more stubborn during COVID based on the data that we heard from our participants. And that entrenchment is complicated because it resided at a three-way intersection between what was going on in the workplace, what kind of social systems we created to support workplaces, and the most dangerous element that we saw was the internalization of the ideal worker image within working mothers themselves. And I'll share with you some of the quotes that we heard from the mothers and some of the things that we found in each of these domains. So let's start with the ideal worker organizational norms. We'll start with the workplace. During COVID, work has intensified, and it has intensified either because industries were going through crises, so we had to respond to the crisis as an organization and as employees, but work also intensified because many organizations were just not used to having their workforce work from home. So there was a lot of meetings, controls, structure, oversight, because they wanted to make sure that their employees are working, so which increased the burden on parents. The work first expectation, so to put and prioritize work, also persisted during the pandemic. The unspoken rule, as one of our participants share, if you care about your job and care about your future, you'd better be there. And there were a lot of companies that were talking about going back to the office, even when the environments were not ready for them. Another participant shares, if you think you can just continue working from home, you don't care about your job. And again, that was in the summer of 2020. So even before we started feeling we were out of this pandemic. In terms of support, what we saw is that there was an intention to support. So a lot of organizations wanted to support, but all of that intent did not really translate into actionable policies. So there were well-intended messages, happy emails, an acknowledgement that parents actually had an added burden during this pandemic, but that was, for the most part, really just left for mothers and parents to ask for help themselves. So let's go to what was happening outside of the workforce, outside of the workplace. Pre-COVID, what we've noticed is that a lot of families had things hanging on a thread. So what happened with COVID is that it highlighted the importance of the work of those who support our work. So when all the schools, daycares, access to help disappeared, our reaction was to regress back to stereotypical gender norms for the most part. And a lot of the responsibilities of the family, all of that fell back on the shoulders of women and the shoulders of mothers. So what that tells us in terms of how we reacted to that situation is that historically we have created all those social systems in terms of schooling, daycare, also access to cheap help that really reinforced the ideal worker image in the workplace and allowed continue with female employment and continuing employment with of people who found systems so that they don't have to worry too much about what was happening outside of the workforce. So that really puts into question how much we value care as a society and whether those systems that we created are poorly designed in that they center the ideal worker rather than actually centering care. And that is definitely a question that we need to continue discussing and we need to continue addressing as we go out of this pandemic. The third element is the internalization of the ideal worker image. And that was really painful to hear from our participants. We heard a lot of words of guilt and failure. And what is really interesting is that this was the most consistent thing in our data, is that every single mother we talked with used that language of personal failure. And the shared experience shows that this is not an isolated personal experience, but rather a shared experience that is a result of institutionalized systems, that this is a systemic problem that actually needs systemic solutions. So the mothers that we talked to resorted, because they experienced this as a personal problem, an individual problem, they resorted to individual solutions and individual solutions that are not necessarily healthy, like sacrificing self-care, sacrificing sleep. A lot of them engage in what we call temporal boundary management so that they will attend to their family responsibilities and kids schooling during the day, and then work either evening or before the kids wake up. In addition to that, there was a lot of labor to mask motherhood in a very difficult situation when work came home. They still engaged in those efforts to mask motherhood and to pass as the professional or that ideal worker. Now, there was one beacon of hope that I want to focus on, and that's what we call pockets of managerial support. So even within those turbulent times in organizations, we have seen that with many of our participants, they talked about isolated silos of support from managers. And that highlights the importance of managerial support when it comes to work family issues and work life balance. And I want to, this is something that Bridget Schultz talks about. She calls it the boss lottery. And when we want to go out of this pandemic, the hope is that we move away from that mere chance of having a boss that is supportive and creating systems that would create supportive bosses and supportive managers. So what can we take from all of this? Having all of those experiences led us to write the 3 ways companies can retain moms right now. And this was an urgent issue, definitely during the pandemic, and it continues to be an urgent issue as we go back to the offices. So we focus on those 3 things. The first one is to provide certainty and clarity wherever possible. We have lived a turbulent year with a lot of uncertainty, and now we are going back to the offices, and your employees need a lot of certainty around, are they allowed, or do they have the chance to work from home? How is the going back to the office is going to look like? And I say, don't be this leader. Your employees have spent about a year and a half saving your businesses from their dining table. So we know that working from home is something that works. Don't take that away. And there's a recent report by McKinsey that's showing that 9 out of 10 companies are actually considering having work from home solutions, but we still don't know how that looks like. So clarity around that is definitely needed. The second thing is to right-size job expectations. I'm noticing that a lot of people, a lot of managers are using language like going back to work. And when managers use that language, going back to work, your employees are wondering, when did we stop working? We are currently right now in probably a burnout pandemic, which is the result of the COVID pandemic. And we definitely, as managers, as companies, we need to take that into consideration, acknowledge it, and find solution. Like a lot of companies right now, or some companies, are trying to have specific self-care days off, so that to at least in a way address this burnout. The third thing is to continue with the empathy. Interestingly enough, we all had a certain level, and we saw that from our participants, is that empathy was granted at the beginning of the pandemic, but it didn't last for long. So for the beginning of the pandemic, many people were very comfortable and permitting and of having, for example, kids jump in Zoom calls and things like that. But that disappeared pretty quickly. And this year has been very difficult, as I shared with the burnout pandemic right now. So this is definitely the time to continue with the empathy and creating cultures within your offices that will encourage managers to be supportive rather than barriers to support. So that's what I wanted to share with you this morning. And as I said, the hope is for us to have this context and have this situation in the back of our minds as we continue discussing our research and pushing our research agenda forward. So let's continue the conversation.
Good. Thank you very much, Mona. And I think that everyone will, agree that we can take 5 more minutes before we go today, because there are a few questions that we would like to pose to you. So one being, thank you, Galina, that she's mentioning, have you heard things regarding changing norms on what is expected from mothers and fathers? Do you think that actually maybe there has been a regression to the old kind of like gender norms, or on the other way, that it's been the opposite, and actually this has helped to advance in that changing of norms of what is expected from moms and dads?
Right. So for the most part, from the participants that we talked with, we did feel that mothers, at least from the language that they used with us, that they were overwhelmed and they had different expectations when it comes to their family responsibilities. Some of the questions that we asked our mothers was to understand how they divided their space, how they divided their time, And we have seen that there was a gendered division of space where it was mostly the father who, if they were working from home, they would get the isolated space, and the mother tried to set up her space in a way that she will have access to her kids, or her kids will have access to her whenever possible, while also trying to, if she's working with other people where she cannot have her kids interrupt, she also needed to manage that. So we have seen more of that. And I also want to highlight that even for the mothers whose jobs were very intense and they really needed to just isolate from the family and have their own offices, they also communicated a lot of guilt around that. So it was either the gendered roles was either, these were apparent either in the way the roles were actually divided, or also still in the guilt that these mothers communicated. But the hope, back then in March of 2020 and during the year, I don't think we had time to communicate. And we can see from our participants that there was not a pause for the most part, there was not a pause to think through what is going on and to take decisions proactively. But maybe as we're going out of the pandemic, having experienced that this will be a moment to have those communications and to have those conversations.
Very nice, thank you. And then let me ask two questions together so that you manage the 3 minutes that we have left. And one is by Pedro, that he's asking, how good leaders offer support. So would you have any recommendation? Is that formal support? Is that informally? How would you suggest they do that? And then, well, let's go with this one. Sorry, let's go with this one.
Absolutely. So some of the examples that we saw in our data, there were some managers who would, it was giving time, like seeing your employees, talking with them, and acknowledging that different employees have different situations and different struggles. So it was that one-on-one communication. So some of the examples were having these conversations, and we talk about right-sizing job expectations. So I remember, one participant who shared that her boss was very clear on what is expected from them during or given the pandemic. And they said that, if you give me 50% with what you have right now, I'm happy with that. So it's working through, what you have as goals as a department, as a manager, and try to translate that to what your team can do or what your team members can do given their struggles. And that also translates right now to going back to the office. We still have uncertainty around kids' schedules and all of that. So acknowledging individual struggles would be a good way to start.
Good. So just one word about occupations. Mona, they're asking, did you find any difference between occupations? And can you give us just a flavor of if you found them?
So some of the themes that I shared with you today in terms of emerging from the whole data, these are patterns that we've seen across industries. There were a little bit of variance, but we didn't analyze that data fully to look at that. But if it depended either on the demographic structure of the industry, for example, schools who are used to kids and kids issues, for example, or it also depended on the intensity that the industry was facing. So definitely the more crises industries were going through, the more difficult was to give time to those issues. And ironically, these are the situations where those issues need to be prioritized.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So Mona, thank you very much for your presentation. So I picked many things, but let me just highlight 3 of them. So one is that we are not going back to work because we've been working even harder than ever during these months. So this is, even in the language, is something that we should try to watch over, so that we are very clear that working remotely is also work, and sometimes work that is even more, let's say, intense because of the crisis in this case. Then your finding of gendered space. I think that probably this is a phenomenon that had not happened before, because this is very specific to this crisis where, you know, males and females and children and sometimes even the elders were sharing the same space the whole day. So, and then you saw those gendered spaces when people were working. And then you highlighted that need for support, so specifically from the leaders to make it you know, more manageable and more and better for employees and for families as a whole. So thank you very much for
Thank you so much,
your
Maria.
presentation. It's been really a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.